Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend today's webinar on understanding your dental practice overhead. My name is Andrew Schwartz. I'm partners with my brother Rick Schwartz in the CPA firm of Schwartz & Schwartz based in Woburn, Mass. Each winter we do a couple thousand personal tax returns. About 90% of those are for dentists, physicians, and psychologists. The rest of the year, April 16th through January 31st, we work with about 250 one and two owner medical and dental practices, and about 200 of those are dental practices. So we have a very focused niche CPA firm. With all the dental practices we work with, we collect a whole bunch of data every year from these practices that we repackage and we analyze and we share with our clients to help them better manage their practices, and we're able to share that with other people as well. So I hope you find this presentation interesting today. So we're going to talk about understanding your dental practice overhead. Okay, so if you have a dental practice, there's two ways that you can boost your profits. This is kind of obvious, but one is to increase your collections, collect more money, and the other is to decrease your overhead. And today we're going to talk about decreasing your overhead. We do have a bunch of productivity metrics and other ways to analyze the collections of a practice, and we'll be glad to go over that with you at some time if you want. But for today, we're just going to talk about the overhead that most dental practices seem to pay. Okay, so as I said, if you increase your collections or you decrease your overhead, you're going to increase your profits. In today's environment, if you increase your profits, you actually double up your profits. That's because by increasing your profits, you earn more money each year. And then with the established network of brokers and people selling practices and people buying practices, people pay more money for a more profitable practice. So you get paid once as a practice is more profitable that year, and then you get paid a second time when you sell your practice. Okay, so let's talk about understanding the overhead of a general dental practice. Okay, first of all, when we talk about overhead, we're talking about what we refer to as the non-doctor overhead. And the non-doctor overhead is all the expenses incurred during the year for a practice, excluding the owner compensation and benefits, associate compensation and benefits, interest, taxes, depreciation and amortization, which you get to claim when you write off assets that are purchased. Overhead doesn't include the purchase of equipment and technology, and overhead does not include the repayment of practice debt. So basically, we're going to go over the other components of overhead, but by taking out all of these items, it allows us to compare apples to apples when we're looking at one practice versus another practice. By comparing non-doctor overhead, it factors in just the same numbers for each practice and lets us really get some good information for our clients and for other dentists in the community. All right, so some accounting 101, and then we're going to get into the interesting stuff. There is fixed overhead and there's variable overhead. So fixed overhead doesn't fluctuate as your collections fluctuate. So for instance, rent. You're going to pay the same amount for rent whether you see one patient in a day or see 30 patients in a day. Your monthly rent is fixed. It does go up over time, but your rent is fixed, and more or less your staff costs are fixed. So the amount you pay your front desk person and your assistants and your hygienists, that's pretty much all fixed. It takes a while to hire somebody. You can't hire like 1/10 of a person. You have to hire a whole person. I guess you can hire them part-time, but your staff costs are pretty much fixed. Now, variable costs are those costs that change as your revenue changes, and two obvious variable costs are your lab fees and your dental supplies, right? The more dentistry you do, the more you collect, the more you're going to pay to the lab, and the more you're going to pay in dental supplies, and there is a relationship between those two numbers and revenue. Okay, but it's very interesting. So even though there's fixed overhead, the percentage of those costs as a percentage of your collections is actually in a pretty close range for all practices as well. All right, so as I mentioned, we collect a bunch of data from our clients every year. We put it together in this nice report, this customized overhead analysis report that we sent to each of our dental practice owners. And this year, for the general dentist, we had data from 155 general dental practices. And we divided them into three groups. We have small practices where the collections were less than $600,000 per year. We had mid-sized practices where collections were between $600,000 and $1 million per year. And then larger practices in our sample were those practices that collected more than $1 million. Most of our practices are one owner, one dentist, and maybe an associate practice. So there aren't many multi-owner large dental practices in our sample. And as it turns out, the sample is divided pretty evenly between these three buckets. So a third of the practices were less than 600,000, a third of the practices had collections over $1 million, and a third came in the middle. All right, so let's see what we figured out here. The first thing is I found very interesting. Is this is actually the first time I graphed this information and got the correlation of the numbers. So basically, the x-axis is collections, and the y-axis is non-doctor overhead. There's the whole 155 data points are on there, and look how close those data points of collections and overhead and non-doctor overhead hug the trend line. This came out this year with a correlation of over 90%, which means that based on a practice's collections, overhead is 90% predictable. So that's pretty good. So there is a range of what the overhead expenses are of a practice, and there is some fluctuation, but a 90% correlation is a very high correlation. The overhead for most practices is coming in within a very similar range between all the different practices. So let's start taking a look at some of the different overhead percentages. The first and biggest expense and component of overhead is staff expenses. And don't forget, this is all non-doctor overhead, so it doesn't include anything paid to the owners, and it doesn't include anything paid to the associates. But it does include, staff expenses includes payroll for the front desk people, hygienists and assistants, the payroll taxes and employee benefits that are paid to them, and that includes health insurance and the retirement plan contributions. And the range for most practices for staff expenses, the low end is 22% of collections, and the high end is about 28% of collections. Now, we have clients who pay more than 33% of their collections to their staff each year, and they're paying higher than the range that most people pay. And we have some who are paying less than 22%, not many, but some. And every practice is a little bit different, but there are outliers to both directions with all these different overhead percentages. So let's look at the results of this year's of our overhead analysis. And as I mentioned, we have small practices where collections were below 600,000, mid-sized practices where collections were between 600,000 and $1 million, and large practices which were with collections over $1 million. So if you look at the bottom, the total staff expenses for smaller practices based on our sample ran at 24.5% of collections, and the mid-sized and large practices were close to 28% of collections. The reason that the smaller practices are less is that with a smaller practice, the owner can actually do more of the admin work, type work, that in the larger practices, they need to get people to do the work. They need to get other staff people to do the work. So smaller practices actually pay a little bit less for their staff expenses than the larger practices. And as I mentioned in the range before, they run between 22 and 28%, but the larger practice is closer to the high end of that range. All righty. The next category of expenses is facility expenses. And for most practices, the facility expenses run between 5% and 9% of collections. Facility includes rent that is paid, including rent that an owner would pay if they own, a practice owner would pay if they own the office space as well. So most of our clients, if they individually own the real estate, the practice will pay rent to themselves. So it includes rent, repairs and maintenance, and utilities. And as I said, that generally runs between 5 and 9% of a practice collections for most collections. And let's look at the results. So this year, based on our analysis, the smaller practices actually came in at 12.5%, and that's because it's expensive to rent the space, and if the average comes in over that 9%, it just indicates that the dentist has the opportunity to produce more out of their space than they're currently producing. So the cost for smaller practices for their rent is higher than the high end. The average is 12.5%. The mid-sized practices, because they produce more out of their space, their overhead, their facility costs came in at just over 8%. And for the larger practices, because they're really producing out of their space, their facility costs came in just under 7%. So staff expenses got a little bit higher as a percentage of collections as practices got larger. Facility costs went down as practices grew. Then we have the other two big expenses are dental supplies and lab fees. And for the most part, these expenses each run at about 4 to 8% of collections. Now, keep in mind that with this overhead item, especially with lab, a higher percentage isn't necessarily a negative thing. It could just be that practice is doing more high-end dental work than other practices, and because of that, they're paying more lab bills every year, and they're paying a higher percentage of their revenue towards lab. And a lot of practices who went and they purchased a milling unit, the CEREC unit, they'll see their lab fees go down because a lot of the crowns are generated in their office, and the only cost is the $30 block of porcelain. All right, so let's see how these numbers came in this year based on our analysis. And dental supplies, smaller practices spent, it looks like almost 9% of their income on their collections on dental supplies, and the lab was 4.5%. Mid-size was 6.8 and 4.2%, and larger practices were 6.7 and 5% for lab. I think with mid-size practices, it just happens in our sample that a large percent of our mid-size practices have CERECs, and it actually pushes the lab cost down a little bit. But over the whole range of practices, besides the fact that the supplies seem a little bit higher for smaller practices, they're really pretty similar between each of the practices. 6.8, 6.7% for dental supplies, and 4 to 5% for lab fees. Okay, so another group of overhead expenses, another important one is advertising and promotion. And it seems like most of our practices spend between 1 and 2% of their collections on advertising and promotion. Now, this doesn't include the time you or your staff spent on marketing efforts. It's just this is the cost of web advertising or purchasing printed materials, things like that. Anecdotally, Fred Joyal of 1-800-DENTIST, who wrote the book Everything is Marketing, he actually recommends that dental practices pay between 6 and 8% of their collections on advertising and promotion. But he probably believes that, but also he gets a piece of that 6 and 8% if people sign up for 1-800-DENTIST. I do want to point out that, and I may have a slide later on this, but when it comes to advertising and promotion, actually the most cost-effective way to promote your practice, there's the 4 best things that you can do. One is you get referrals from your patients. So if your patients have a great experience, then your patients are going to refer their friends and family, and that actually doesn't cost anything. And that's the first and best way to bring in new patients to the practice. Second is you should really have a good website for your practice. Who does anything these days without checking out the website of any business that they're going to work with, or any restaurant that they're going to go to dinner? So a good website is important. You also a very cost-effective way to advertise is with Google and Facebook ads. You can set a daily allowance, and it's very targeted, that marketing. And lastly, if you can solicit your patients to put up good reviews, that's another important way to market. And all of that, those 4 steps, it's all quite None of it's very expensive. It's not like the old days when you would pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on direct mail or Valpak or things like that. Okay, didn't mean to get off topic. Okay, lastly, you have everything else. And this everything else category is what we call the barometer of owner frugality. So some of our clients, they can really, they're really frugal and they don't spend a lot of money on anything. They spend as little as possible and they're happy doing it that way. And other ones of our clients can't control themselves and they just spend. And this number ends up being high. This everything else includes computer and software costs, continuing education, insurance, office supplies, professional fees, telephone, utilities, and everything else that you spend. And as I said, the range is between 7 and 10%. The frugal ones get below 7. The ones who can't control their spending are higher than 10. And let's just look at a quick recap. I know I went through this pretty quick, but basically, here's the range I put for each of these expenses. So staff expenses, remember, ran between 22 and 28% of collections. Facility expenses ran between 5 and 9%. Dental supplies ran between 4 and 8% of collections. Lab ran between 4 and 8%. Advertising and promotion generally runs between 1 and 2%. And everything else runs between 7 and 10%. So the frugal dentist who really keeps an eye on his or her overhead can get his overhead below 45%. And we do have general dental practices whose overhead comes in below 43%, below 45%. And on the high end, we have other ones who are spending 65% of their collections on overhead. And a practice doing $1 million, that's a $200,000 swing of net income between the frugal dentist and the dentist who can't really control their spending so great. So, but it's a range. And even though as I said, the collections is a 90% predictor of revenue of overhead expenses, non-doctor overhead expenses, their standard deviation's pretty high and different practices do it different ways. All right, so this is a lot of information on a small slide, but you can see this is the overhead report. And if you look at the very last line, the total overhead expenses for small practices this year for 2017 ran at 63.6% of collections. And this doesn't include money paid to the associate. Mid-sized practices ran at 57.3% of collections. And the larger practices overhead ran at 54.5% of collections. So the bigger the practice, there's economies of scale, and the overhead for those practices decreases as the practice gets larger. Okay, and then just to look at one more piece of information, the smaller practices ran at, as I said, 63.6% was their overhead. They paid 1.2% on average to associates. So the smaller practices made 35.2% of each dollar collected. The $1 million practices, the mid-sized practices paid 57.3% of their collections on overhead, 3.6% on associates. So they made 39.1%. And the $1 million practices at 54.5%. They paid more on average for their associates because they're bigger practices and they need associates to do the work. So they paid 9.3% of their collections on average to the associates. So they made 36.2%. So the mid-sized practices had the highest profit to the owner, but the largest practices had the largest dollar profit per owner. So, okay, and then what high overhead means. Basically, high overhead doesn't always mean you just have to slash expenses. Sometimes it means that you have capacities to fill, your fees are too low, you're not doing a good job collecting the accounts receivable, or your mix of procedures, you're just doing a lot more hygiene and low-end dentistry and less high-end dentistry than your colleagues. All right, so, okay. So let's just spend the last few minutes talking about ways that you can cut your costs. And then here's a little cartoon, and this guy says, Greg, we need to talk about your out-of-pocket expenses. And if you look, the guy has pockets on his pants, pockets on his shirt. He has a lot of pockets. So it's a play on the word pockets. Very funny. Okay. So first is there are ways to make your front desk staff more efficient. So you know when you're driving around and you're on a street that has traffic lights and the traffic lights are working. Well, driving around is a piece of cake. It's very predictable. The lights work the same way all the time. The traffic flows as well as it's going to flow at that hour of the day. But what happens when there's a policeman trying to manage the traffic? So that the lights are out and you have a policeman directing traffic. Well, it becomes gridlock. The policeman's doing the best they can, but every policeman is going to do it differently. They don't do all the things they're supposed to do, and before you know it, there's gridlock. Well, that happens with your front desk staff too. And what I'm recommending is you can improve your communication with patients, and you can save payroll dollars by automating some of the front desk function. And the way people are doing that are with these popular software products. One is Lighthouse 360. Another is Patterson's product is RevenueWell. Solution Reach, which used to be Smile Reminders, and DemandForce. Well, these programs, they sit on top of your practice management program, and they help you just work more efficiently and interact with your patient base more efficiently. So when these programs are set up correctly, they confirm appointments. When there's cancellations, there's some way that they try to fill the schedule following cancellations. There's a way that they can reactivate patients who haven't been in for a while, or try to reactivate patients. They send out surveys following the appointment, which is very important to get that information, and they promote Yelp and Google reviews. So it's automated. It's not your front desk person trying to get to it when they're doing 10 different things at the end of the day before they leave. This is done consistently and systematically and every day the same way to the same people. And so so not only are you getting better information, but you're saving payroll costs because some of these tasks are very labor intensive. Okay, another way to save money is to manage your account receivable costs. Maintaining accounts receivable is expensive. They say that it costs about $10 per month to manage each active account. And it costs $7.26, I don't know where they came up with this from, to send out each billing statement between printing the letter, the postage, and the person's time to maintain it and to do it. And plus, when money isn't collected, it's an opportunity cost. It's lost investment potential. So we recommend to our clients to consider using a collection service. Because chasing after delinquent accounts is expensive. It's tough sometimes to put the front desk person on the spot and have them help with the task of collecting money. And it helps the front desk staff, frankly, adhere to the financial policies of the practice. So utilizing a collection service is a cost-effective way to manage delinquent accounts. All right, and one other way to save some money is with your leases. So if you own your office space, and this isn't really relevant, but if you lease your office space, every time around the time that the lease is coming up for renewal, even if you have a renewal option, you have the opportunity to negotiate your lease and to negotiate these specific terms. So basically, you can negotiate the monthly cost for the rent per square foot. You can negotiate some months of free rent, and you can negotiate for the landlord to pay for tenant improvement. So let's say you've been in the office for 15 years. The place is starting to look a little bit old. As part of your lease renewal, you can go to the landlord and you can say, listen, first of all, I think the rent's too high. I want to, I feel like the rent should be reduced a little bit. I've been paying rent for 15 years. Maybe you can give me a few free months of rent, or I'm going to do a big project where I won't be generating any revenue for a few months, but perhaps you can give me free rent then. And I want to fix this place up. I would like you to provide me a certain allowance to be able to do that. And I'm sure you're saying to yourself, how am I going to negotiate that with a landlord? And the good news is there's actually a company out there that does this, and they act as your broker, and it ends up being free to you. The landlord ends up paying the cost to these lease negotiating people. And the one that we've seen a lot is called Car Healthcare Realty. So the the lease negotiating people, Matt Car Realty, they act as your broker, and they negotiate on your behalf. And when the negotiation is done, believe it or not, the landlord writes a check to Car Healthcare Realty. It's the same thing like if you go and you're traveling and you buy your airline ticket. If you buy it directly from the airline, you pay one price. If you buy it from the travel agent, you pay the same price, except a portion of that money goes as a commission to the travel agent. In commercial real estate, for the most part, there is money set aside by the landlord for these broker commissions. I guess the bigger the company, the more likely they are going to have professional representation. So on the surface, it's kind of crazy. These guys are going to negotiate better lease terms for you. And then at the end of the day, the landlord is paying these people to negotiate against the landlord. So it's kind of crazy, but we've seen it. We've seen it with big success. Your facility costs are your second highest expense grouping after staff expenses. So as long as you give these guys about 18 months, 2 years notice, which sounds like a long time, but it really isn't because time goes by very quickly, they potentially can help you reduce your facility costs and increase profits. Okay, so I think that's the last slide I got. My firm again is Schwartz & Schwartz. The website is schwartzaccountants.com. So on that website, you can schedule an appointment to meet with one of our CPAs. We have online tax and financial newsletters and blogs. You can sign up to receive our newsletter, and then there's our Facebook and our Twitter. So I know I covered a lot of information, but I think in 40 minutes that was fine. Lastly, this is all put together in a report that we will gladly email to you. So just if you don't have our email address, go to Schwartz Accountants. You can find me on there. My email address should be on there. We're proud of this report. The information is very, very valuable. The report includes a whole nother section on the practice metrics, productivity metrics, on the revenue side, and on things like this. And we would be more than happy to share that with you. And if you have any questions, you can email me directly. It's actually, my email is andrew@schwartzaccountants.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you soon.